everybody. So we are going to talk a little bit more about political geography and how the different themes intersect and why it matters. So let's just jump right in. So first of all, the difference between a nation and a state. State would be synonymous with country. Nation, on the other hand, is going to be more of a cultural identity. Now, you can have a state that is not a nation. You can have a nation that is not a state, and you can have a nation state. And then just also background to remember is centripetal versus centrifugal forces. Remember centripetal, that P, you can remember peace, so unifying factors. Centrifugal fights, disunifying factors. And you can remember that F for fights, P for peace, in case you have trouble switching those. A former Yugoslavia, a state, not a nation. Why? If you look at this little map here, you can see that this is not a unified culture. There's lots of different ethnicities. They have different religions, cultural backgrounds. There's a lot of disputes in the past as well, conflicts, even genocide. So this is a good example of a state, not a nation. And that lack of, nation sense did eventually lead to it completely breaking apart. Then we'll just kind of look a little bit at these boundaries. This is an interesting map. This boundary isn't exactly correct, but before the Mexican-American War, Mexico went much further up into the United States. President Polk basically asked Mexico to give them a certain amount of land to the U.S., and Mexico said no. And so thus started the Mexican-American War, which ended with the U.S. taking that land. This is an interesting map of Africa, the colorful boundaries. You can see the ethnicities and the sort of nations that were there before the Berlin Conference, where European powers basically just carved it up and chopped it up. This goes to England, this goes to France, and there was really no consideration for what was already under these lines. And so you can imagine that's going to cause a lot of problems. The idea of a stateless nation, so you can be a nation with no state. Great examples of this would be Palestinians, Native Americans, and Kurds. So you can see the idea of Kurdistan is where these kind of lines are here. And there's a lot of Kurds, and they would like to have their own land. So that's a great example as well. And then the concept of being a state and a nation is going to mean you're going to have basically a united culture, identity, maybe religion even, within a boundary where everyone can kind of identify. So a great example is Japan, because the borders of Japan within that is 99% Japanese. The United States is sometimes used as an example of a nation state, which is a little bit different because there's a lot of diversity of culture, religion, everything in the United States. But this idea of patriotism, of I am an American, that's the idea of the nation. If you identify as an American, the nation of America, even though it's diverse, that could be considered a nation state. You'll see different opinions on that. Okay, and then let's move right into the different characteristics of states and why it matters. So thinking about a microstate, which would be a very small state, an example would be the Vatican. If you look at this map down here, here's a little map of the world, and you can see there's Italy. And then within this zoomed in map of Europe, you can see the boot of Italy and tiny little Vatican City there. So very small, but very powerful, because that is where the Pope is. And you can watch my video in the module after this with a little more detail about that. It's really interesting. In contrast, you have Russia, who is an enormous state, But you can imagine going up north of this latitude line here, not super habitable up in Siberia. So, and it can even cause problems for Russia, how large and uninhabited certain areas are. So the moral of the story is size is not necessarily an indicator for success. The United States, very large, very powerful. Russia, larger, not more powerful. And then you probably memorize these vocabulary terms of prorrupt, compact, fragmented, perforated, elongated, but why does it matter? What are the implications? So compact state, it's this idea of, this like similar radius anywhere out from the center, and it's supposed to provide the most geographic stability. Examples include Poland and Iceland, Zimbabwe. A fragmented state, this can be centrifugal. It needs to consist of two or more pieces. Great examples are Indonesia, the Philippines, but it it depends, make interactions more difficult. Elongated, this can create separatist areas due to the distance from the center or core. Great examples of elongated states are Vietnam, Chile, and Norway. Prorrupt states, similar to elongated. So it's going to be more of like, compact area, and then eruption, prorupts right out of there. Try to remember it that way. But it can, again, create this room for separatist factions. So a perforated state, if you think about like perforated paper that already has the holes in it. So it's like hole punch, and now the country is perforated. So South Africa is a great example of this. It is perforated by Lesotho. And so Lesotho would be called an enclave because it's surrounded by South Africa. And I don't know in the order if we've talked about apartheid yet in South Africa, but this made things very difficult for Lesotho during that period of time. And apartheid just ended in the 1990s. So the moral of the story is that territory, size, and shape can influence political stability, but it does not determine social, political, or economic well-being. So just remember that it can, but it does not definitely do it. So jumping right into boundaries. What is a boundary? Basically a vertical plane that cuts through airspace and the ground to determine ownership. And we'll talk a little bit about how it can be demarcated or delineated. I'm just going to kind of skip ahead here. So if it's defined, that means it's legally written. Delimitation, it's been mapped, drawn. Demarcation, that means there's going to be some sort of a physical boundary there, posts, walls, fences, something like that. So a geometric boundary is going to be like a straight line boundary, totally unrelated to physical features. It could be like along a latitude line, something like that. But a good example is the United States border with Canada. It's just kind of drawn across there, even through like bodies of water. Whereas a physical political, or you might hear a natural political boundary, is going to conform to a physical feature, such as Mexico and the US. The boundary is the Rio Grande River. Those kind of boundaries make a little more sense to me. We have this term called genetic boundaries. And within that, we have antecedent boundaries, such as those in Malaysia. They're defined before the area is well populated. These boundaries are set upon natural formations and are historical lines drawn before human cultures really took root. In contrast, subsequent boundaries are shaped by human cultures and evolve over time. A good example could be the boundary between Vietnam and China, which developed along with the cultural landscape and kind of reflects, social, cultural, and ethnic diversities. So these types of lines can really tell the story of human settlement and interaction across time. Superimposed, forcibly drawn across a culturally unified landscape. You can see an example here with Papua New Guinea. And a relic boundary has ceased to function, but the imprints are still evident in the cultural landscape. So a good example of that would be like North and South Vietnam. Real quick, we'll jump into these boundary disputes. There's a lot of this going on right now. If you just type into your Google search, like news on boundary disputes, you'll find a whole bunch of stuff going on right now. So you can look into that with a little bit more detail. But there's different kinds of disputes. So for a dispute to be territorial or definitional, think whose land is it? Whereas positional or locational will focus on the delimitation and demarcation of the border. The interpretation of the definition is the dispute. So for example, Saudi Arabia and Yemen have this oil-rich border there's not a lot of specifications in their treaty. So that creates a real positional, locational dispute for them. A functional or operational border dispute has to do with like how the border should function. So for example, the United States and Mexico can have disputes because they have to work together on how each side handles cross-border migration. Another example of this could be, this is actually different, an allocational border dispute. The allocation is like, how something is dispersed. So allocational border dispute is like a boundary due to the location of resources. So where should this water from the Colorado River be allocated? California, Colorado, who has these rights. So that is going to be more of an allocational dispute. So the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea established a comprehensive framework to regulate all ocean space. It balances the freedom of the seas with the rights of states to harness marine resources, ensuring maritime security and protecting the marine environment. You can kind of see, I guess this is kind of probably hard for you to see this, but you can just get an idea of the different areas of maritime claims. So the Spratly Islands, they're located in the South China Sea, and they're the center of a complex territorial dispute going on currently, and has been going on for a long, long time. So it's really rich in resources and strategically positioned. These islands are claimed by multiple nations, and each asserts historical and legal rights. And so this creates a lot of tension. The Senkaku Islands, that would be the name Japan gives them. A small group of uninhabited islands in the East China Sea. They're the focal point of a lot of geopolitical tension. This is really blown up right now too. They're claimed by China, Taiwan, and Japan. And these islands are significant. Again, strategic location, resources, and it really impacts diplomatic relations and regional stability. It's like an ongoing tension. And then just kind of finishing up, it's interesting to note that, there's approximately 200 countries, but just how many you might, like some people just assume all these countries have been there for hundreds or thousands of years, but a lot of countries are quite new. So in the 1960s, you can see all those yellow countries were new. 1970s is going to be like the orange up on this map. 1980s is going to be the green color. So you can see Zimbabwe, some of these areas here. And the 1990s, tons of new countries. It's going to be the light yellow. And then finally, the 2000s, we have purple. And this is not totally up to date, but up to about like 2010. So that concludes this brief overview. And I hope that helps kind of connect some of these concepts and how they can influence a state. Thank you.